But we're going to but we will come back, and please do be ready with some questions. I know there'll be lots coming out of that. I'm going to move on to our fourth speaker, if I may, Alessandra Lemma, our final speaker, a psychotherapist and director of the Psychological Therapies Development Unit at the Tavistock Clinic. Now, your interests are focused on body image disturbances, so body dysmorphia and body modification practices, trauma and adolescent development. And you are indeed the author of Under the Skin, which is a psychoanalytic study of body modification. So please welcome Professor Alessandra Lemma. And very well placed, I think, to come in last on this. At one extreme, Alessandra, there are people who would say that radical alteration of the body is always a sign, a kind of pathology. What would your position be on that?
I think if you wanted a categorical answer to that, it would have to be no. I don't think it can be seen always as a sign of pathology. But of course, as a psychoanalyst, I'm not interested in categorical answers because the human mind is far more complex than that. And the first thing to say is that we all modify our bodies. Everyone here in this room, by putting makeup on, getting dressed, has modified their body. So when we look at people who radically modify their bodies and point to say, well, I'm not like that, I think that in itself can be thought about as quite a defensive retreat away from thinking about what it means to actually inhabit a body, which puts us all under tremendous pressure. And I want to highlight three things that perhaps can be picked up in the discussion. The first thing to say is that the body is our anchor in reality, which means that even if we can delay the signs of aging, as you were describing to us, the body goes inexorably in one direction only, and that's underground. And you heard it first in Selfridges, okay? So the second thing to say is that living in a body means having to acknowledge that it has been given to us. It's not of our own making. I don't mean this in any religious sense, but that actually two people have to come together to create a body. And actually, what that means is that forevermore, whatever you do to your bodies, you always have to acknowledge that the body bears the trace of otherness, of the other. And this is a fact of life that can be very difficult because we all struggle to varying degrees with accepting our dependency on others, the fact that we are indebted to others in different ways. And the final aspect of what it means to be embodied, which I think is problematic and may explain why we all modify our bodies, is that by virtue of our embodied nature, we are always subject to the gaze of the other. We are always being looked at by the other. Now, being looked at can raise all sorts of anxieties. It can raise anxieties that have to do, let's say, more with our desirability. Am I all right? Am I going to be loved? If I change various aspects of myself, will I be loved more? But also, being looked at means that we can feel very intruded upon. So sometimes the modification of the body is a way of managing the felt to be intrusiveness of the other by taking ownership of the body and remodeling it according to an image that makes us feel that the body is my own, that I put my own very personal stamp on it, which may be one of the reasons why people tattoo their bodies, and we might come back to this point.
Nous donne le très bon exemple de la transformation. Donc je ne vois pas pourquoi on ne ferait pas comme la nature, parce que entre la tête d'un bébé et la tête d'un adolescent, la tête de quelqu'un qui a 30 ans et quelqu'un qui a 50, 60, 70, 80, c'est de l'extrême Macover. C'est affreux et c'est obligatoire. Alors que quelqu'un qui essaye justement de faire bouger les barreaux de la cage, qui essaye de sortir du cadre, il limite la nature.
In a sense, when we see nature, there's an extreme makeover as well, because we go from the face of an infant to that of a child, an adolescent, and someone who's 50, 60, 70, 80. That's a really extreme makeover. So whoever is trying to change their body in this radical manner is, in a sense, imitating nature as well.
I mean, in terms of the issues of whether it's always pathological or not, as I said, I don't believe that it is. I think that what is more interesting is to approach this question from the point of view of what's its meaning, what are we trying to do? Because we all have a story to tell, and we may not choose to tell this story, but the story that none of us can avoid telling is the story that our bodies inevitably narrate. So through the way we present ourselves to the world, we are telling a very individual story, and that's obviously what I'm interested in as a psychoanalyst. And I think it's a more helpful platform for considering these body modifications than to actually categorize things as forms of psychopathology necessarily. Having said that, if a behavior, whatever it is, and for tonight's purposes we're talking about body modification, but if a behavior becomes compelling and necessary to maintain a sense of who we are, to be able to face the outside world, then that deserves very careful attention. Because it's one thing to have a tattoo or two because it makes us feel a bit better. It's another thing to feel that unless I have a tattoo every month, I actually can't leave my house, or a cosmetic surgery procedure, or whatever it is.
So, Alessandra, you raised something very interesting there, because you talk about alterations as perhaps, unless I misunderstood you, a way of escaping from our parents and our genetic inheritance, that we're trying to make ourselves individual rather than the product of our genetics. But on the other hand, I'm conscious that we are also sometimes trying to conform. So to have the Kate Middleton nose, for instance, to be au courant with the, what the look is of the moment. Do you sense that dichotomy?
I think there is always a tension between what it means to become an individual and to fashion ourselves out in an individual manner, and the way in which that very fashioning actually makes us much more conformist. And you see that in adolescence, of course. So adolescence, developmentally speaking, is a time when the modification of the body, you could say, is a very appropriate way of trying to claim a sense of oneself as separate from the parents. But in making yourself different from your parents, you are conforming to another view, which makes you actually not so independent. And of course, nowadays, because parents are doing the very things that young people were trying to do, we've got to push the boundary ever more to make ourselves very distinct.
Yes. Mo, did you want to come in?
Yes, just briefly on my own subject on tattooing. I noticed that, these days more than in the past, people being heavily tattooed, I mean heavily tattooed, like arms, legs, almost a full bodysuit or a full bodysuit. There are more and more people. There was a picture before of a guy with a full back. That was his first tattoo. But it really depends, ultimately, it's always very subjective to the person. Because if the person consciously wants a bodysuit, but carries on his life unaffected by the fact that he's heavily tattooed, I think it's quite of a normal fact these days. Maybe people with far less tattooed can be more compelled and more troubled in wanting more. So I don't think it's the amount of body modification, but more what that body modification means to ultimately to the wearer or to the subject at end.
It's not so much the visual outcome that they're after, but it's the process of transformation which becomes very compelling, in fact.
Can I just add, I'm fascinated by what you say, and I agree that we are trying to control our own destiny through looks, but at the same time, had I been born with a different face and body, sort of, say, Heidi Klum or someone like that, a supermodel, I wouldn't have changed a thing. I was only trying to make myself into an image that, or a masquerade even, that is more acceptable and more highly rewarded in this society we live in. It was to gain an advantage and to gain power. It wasn't because I had any sort of psychological issues. Again, had I been born with different genes and I didn't have this combination inside that was my genetic lottery ticket, I would have pursued something totally different, maybe studied people who do it like you do. So that's my take on it.
Cindy, you used a word there, masquerade, and when Alessandra was talking, I wrote down the word mask, because this idea of protecting yourself from the world, from people's gaze, by creating a different look. Did that resonate with you?
No, not at all. I'm not protecting myself. I am creating, because we look at people and we judge them instantly. We form conclusions about whether we want to know them or not, whether we want to have sex with them or not, whether we want to meet them, or whether we want to cross the street to avoid them. And you can control that thought, the way people perceive you, by changing the way you look or adjusting the way you look to gain the desired response. That's the masquerade, not hiding behind a mask. It's a slight different dynamic.
Yeah. I want to open it up to the floor, and I hope hands are going to shoot up. But before I do that, who